It's 2010. A movie called Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is opening at your local theater, and being a fan of Edgar Wright, you attend, assuming you'll be treated to a well-written comedy with slick visuals, sharp editing, and a killer soundtrack. And you're not disappointed. Michael Cera's muted reactions make you laugh, the thumping garage rock jams make you jump in your seat, and that scene where Brie Larson sings Black Sheep makes you nonchalantly adjust to hide your visible erection from your unsuspecting date. Overall, you've had a pretty good time. But on your way out, as you instinctively jump shot your half-empty package of Milk Duds onto the mountain of snacks and cardboard overflowing from the waste bin, you hear it. A hushed voice behind you, distinctly saying, "Well, it was good, but the comic was better." Morbidly curious, you do your research, and shockingly, you discover Scott Pilgrim is, in fact, a pre-existing comic book. And not only that, but people really like it. Not to be made into one of those fans, however, like so many other adaptations, you simply ignore the original, never to discover what the key differences are and which is truly better. Well, lucky for you, time makes fools of us all, and 12 years later, I am here to shove that debate right down your throat. Because adaptation is a hot fucking ticket these days, and we need to talk about what makes a good one. Now here's how the story goes. In 2004, Brian Lee O'Malley had just published the first volume of Scott Pilgrim. It ruled, the people rejoiced, and Oni Prest asked him very nicely if they could broker a movie deal. O'Malley wasn't sure it was a good idea, but then again money, and the creative team of Edgar Wright and co-writer Michael Bacall were sure to involve O'Malley heavily in their process. This was the first great decision they made, especially because Scott Pilgrim the comics weren't actually finished yet. So began the intensive process of taking a long, written story and making it into a movie, which are notoriously seen, not read, and also not that long. Now, being a director of substantial style and visual flair, the unique art, pop culture worship, and idiosyncratic visual flow of Scott Pilgrim the comic would be safe in the hands of Mr. Cornetto. But the beating heart was still O'Malley's writing, and this being a time when superhero movies were still mostly bad and all other nerd culture adaptations were exclusively laughably bad, the growing fan base was preparing to see the cult unceremoniously butchered from their classic. That ultimately didn't happen, but it also maybe should have, at least back then. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a very good movie. It's loads of fun, and it's developed its own cult following, separate from the comics. But while it was well received, it was also a financial flop, not earning back so much as its production budget. We'll get into that later though. For now, let's talk about how the creative team went about their adaptation, and what worked, as well as what didn't.
Thank you.
The first thing the writers said when they got to work adapting Scott Pilgrim the comic is, well, there's a lot going on here, Brian. What's the most important thing to follow? Scott Pilgrim, says Brian. His name is on the tin, every volume, without fail. He's the ticket. He's the heart and soul. So they cast Michael Cera to play him. The kid from Arrested Development who makes out with his cousin. That guy. It's an odd choice, maybe even a bad one. On the surface, at least. In the comics, Scott is by no means a hot commodity, but a big part of his character is his charming slacker appeal, which makes him kind of an accidental and, more importantly, oblivious player. Sort of like Pete Davidson. So why cast a human Bambi like Michael Cera to play him? Because it's funny, obviously, as the majority of his deeper character moments will have to be glossed over anyway. Seeing this guy who looks like he collects model trains and doesn't even play with them sort of bewilderedly stumble his way through concert nights, kung fu fights, and most importantly brightly colored goth girl tights becomes an active part of the bit. Scott Pilgrim the movie is now a full-tilt comedy, and that's a genius move. Here's why. Like any comic that runs more than one single volume, Scott Pilgrim is a winding, genre-bending story with lots of characters, angles, and in-universe lore. Edgar Wright and Michael Bacall do not have time for this, so they bring out the scythe and they start cutting elements. Lynette, Lisa, Knives' ninja assassin dad, most of the cutting is characters, but with that comes subplot issues, and so the infrastructure needs repair. The Battle of the Bands is created to help maintain a 3-act structure, some of the fights with the X's are reworked for simplicity's sake, most notably Todd and the Kariyanagi twins. Backstories are left implied, Scott doesn't need money to live, the entire subspace concept is shaved down to a fairly ambiguous joke, but it works, all of it works, because the thing about comedy is it's easy to buy. The crazy video game anime world of Scott Pilgrim is a lot to take in. People have visible flavor text floating above their heads, vegans are telekinetic, Ramona pulls a big fuck-off hammer out of her purse, it's bananas. But it doesn't need rules and extended flashback sequences if Edgar Wright, master of visual comedic storytelling, TM, is doing the heavy lifting for you. So comedy was prioritized to keep the spirit of the comics alive without getting too in the weeds. That worked exceedingly well. What, then, does such a decision sacrifice? In a word, depth. I mentioned earlier that Scott Pilgrim the movie was made concurrently with the comics. Basically, O'Malley was writing the comics all the way through development. This is a high-risk, high-reward adaptation strategy that capitalizes on hype. It works significantly better with movies than it does with shows because, to fit into a 3-act package, most of the middle crap needs to be shaved down anyway. Akira did it, and the results were promising. Fullmetal Alchemist 2003 saw somewhat worse response. Game of Thrones caused an internet meltdown. Like I said, better with movies, but also better with the original creator heavily involved. And while Akira had Otomo literally writing and directing, O'Malley was effectively an overqualified consultant. This left the studio and their writing duo to come up with their own ending, as the movie would need to be done before O'Malley finished the story. There's some bonkers stories that come out of this problem. According to Wright, at least, there were drafts of the script that included Scott turning out to be a delusional serial killer, and, much more hilariously, Gideon turning into a giant transformer. There's not really much information on how seriously some of these pitches were taken, but this should tell you just how hard writing an ending is, which is very important. The ending they landed on was more or less the same as the one you see in the finished movie, except Scott got back together with Knives. This ending tested poorly, and O'Malley, who had recently finished the comics with Scott and Ramona together, felt it diminished Knives' arc, so they shot a new one, with actor Ellen Wong's blessing. Now, my PR team has advised me to avoid commenting on the implications of a story that poses a 23-year-old and a 17-year-old as the healthier of two romances, as that is what we in the business call a visible landmine, but this alternate ending remains a point of contention among fans and critics of Scott Pilgrim the movie alike. Well, why, you ask? If O'Malley intended for Scott and Ramona to end up together, wouldn't that be the end of it? Is that not what makes the most sense? Well, yes, but actually no. Because it relates specifically to the biggest hiccup in the adaptation process. And to break it down, we need to talk at length about Ramona Flowers and the trope of the manic pixie dream girl. Film critic Nathan Rabin coined the term manic pixie dream girl in 2005, describing a stock character who, and I quote, exists solely in the fevered imaginations of sensitive writer-directors to teach broodingly soulful young men to embrace life and its infinite mysteries and adventures. Pretty harsh stuff, right? Now, the term itself has its own tedious history of complication and controversy, but the important information here is that unequivocal e-girl Ramona Flowers of Scott Pilgrim, the movie, either is one or isn't one, and that's a big deal, because a manic pixie dream girl is a bad thing to be, decidedly one-dimensional, and more importantly, problematic, TM. Ramona herself is the element that suffers the most from her adaptation. Scott Pilgrim the comic is a surprisingly tactful story about toxic relationships, the consequences of emotional baggage, the dangers of lingering feelings, and ultimately the importance of loving someone for who they are now, not what they've done or been in the past. Its version of Ramona is a conflicted and deeply flawed character attempting to outgrow her past as it physically comes back to haunt her and the people she's making a newly determined effort to love in a more healthy way. She and Scott follow intertwining arcs as Scott learns to accept what a dick he used to be and the harm he's caused with his innate jealousy and childish self-victimizing. Ramona learns to accept her toxic defense mechanisms and the harm she's caused by wallowing in shame and running away from her problems. Meanwhile, Scott Pilgrim the movie is, and I swear I love it, but it's basically a boss rush. Scott follows a visible but significantly diminished arc about earning self-respect, quite literally, and Ramona, while again somewhat literally reclaiming her emotional agency, mostly just kind of hangs out, especially when it comes to Scott. While she is actually significantly more sour than her comic counterpart, making her at least objectively less manic pixie-esque, the bigger problem the story is left with is that she and Scott don't really seem like they should be a couple, because they don't actively help each other grow like they do in the comic. Clearly, Wright and Bacall originally felt this way, and that's why they wrote their ending, and why some people feel it should have stuck. There's a real problem either way, considering how Knives' overall arc was left comparatively intact, leaving at least one character to act significantly out of character no matter the ending, and making it look kind of like the writers are trying to have their cake and eat it too. But if you put it under the microscope, that awkward snag is a byproduct of their own decisions. The prioritization of comedy, the cutting of side characters' backstories and competing subplots, and most importantly, the aggressive de-nuancing of Scott and Ramona's dynamic risks making their relationship look sort of toxic or worse, transactional. Without the narrative infrastructure that make the comics work as more than just an action comedy, Ramona becomes kind of a quirky MacGuffin, at best an emotional backboard for Scott. Objectively speaking, that's still more narratively interesting than a prize, but while her fickle shtick doesn't necessarily make her a manic pixie dream girl TM, it does continue to make some people hate Scott Pilgrim the movie, probably more than they need to. So where does this leave us? Well, like I said, people generally quite like this movie. For the most part, the creative choices made to turn Scott Pilgrim the comic into Scott Pilgrim the movie were positive. Something always has to be sacrificed when adapting a story for a different medium, and in the case of Scott Pilgrim, weirdly enough, narrative depth was the right call. But its quality doesn't change the fact that it pretty much sex-bombed at the box office. Including the reshoots, this thing cost about $80 million just to make. It didn't break 50 in its theatrical run. It's worth mentioning, most sources chalk up the significance of its failure to bad marketing. Allegedly, it was framed much like a children's movie, with the marketing team having no idea how to sell a bright and kinetic comic book story in an era that was still conditioned by the muted palettes and evanescent soundtracks of early superhero movies. I can't really speak to how true that is. I was 12 at the time. So let's just put it all in context instead, so we can parse the lessons learned here. In the span of 2009 to 2011, a critical time for the future of all nerd culture adaptations, here is a varying list of film adaptations released alongside Scott Pilgrim. Iron Man 2, Thor, and Captain America. Watchmen. The Last Airbender. Dragon Ball Evolution. Prince of Persia, The Sands of Time. What do all these movies, the quality of which spans the entirety of the holy and all-knowing Rotten Tomato meter, have in common? They all made their money back. In fact, with the exceptions of Dragon Ball and Watchmen, all these movies cost over $150 million to make, and more than doubled that in box office revenue. Yeah, in case you forgot, Prince of Persia was a legitimate success, and was at the time praised as a noticeable step forward for video game movies. The lesson learned, I'm sure you're shocked to hear, is that sterilization is key. Not in the way that early superhero movies were edgified for a fictional demographic, and not even in the way The Dark Knight was played as realistic. No, while Scott Pilgrim was criticized almost exclusively for its comparative lack of story, it bombed, ironically, because of the things it held up instead. The early 2010s were simply not ready for all the absurd beauty of nerd culture, and the next era saw an endless parade of cookie-cutter adaptations, big quotation marks there, designed to trick the average viewer into thinking the stock standard blockbuster they were watching was something niche. But it's not all bad. Nature is slowly healing. The explosion of superhero movies and subsequent era of franchise and universe-driven IP hounding did, interestingly enough, bring actual nerd culture to the forefront, leading viewers on a backwards path into the source material. Streaming helped, and so did the proliferation of short-form internet content, spreading niche cultures traditionally kept in the shadows for fear of being ridiculed or stuffed in a locker. But the bottom line is that over the last 12 years, this stuff has become effectively mainstream. As a result, studios have become more lenient on the creative teams behind their adaptations, allowing them to experiment by not changing as much. There's still some issues. The plague of interconnective storytelling, bigger quotation marks there, comes to mind, and some efforts are still just misguided hack jobs of their perfectly functional sources. But the future is brighter every day, as more and more fan bases are rewarded for believing in their favorite properties. Even Scott Pilgrim is getting another chance to shine, with an upcoming animated series set to more accurately adapt the full story. So worry not, you who never bothered to read the comic, and haven't cared about half the shit I just said. You won't have to. Soon enough, nobody will ever have to read again. We did it, boys. We did it. What did we do? I always, every video, I get like a little bit off topic, but I don't know where I am anymore. I have no idea what this fucking video's about.